The last words. Elizabeth had always believed in love. She believed in promises whispered late at night, in the gentle weight of hands held, in the unspoken bond that lasts decades. But all that faith crumbled the day Daniel spoke the words she would never forget. "When you stopped being useful, the years were over." He didn't yell, he didn't plead, he just said it, cold as winter, and walked out of her life forever. For a moment, Elizabeth thought she had misheard him, but the silence of their empty home confirmed the truth. The life she had known, the marriage she had invested herself in, was over. Not because of fights or betrayal, but because she was no longer useful to him. Days turned into weeks, and the wound in her heart was soon mirrored in her body. One morning, she woke up to a darkness that no words could describe. Her vision, once sharp and vivid, was gone. Completely. Doctors were puzzled. "It's deliberate," one whispered to another. "Optic nerve trauma?" Irreversible. Elizabeth's mind refused to accept it. How could life take everything in one cruel stroke? How could the man she loved not just leave, but take her ability to see with him? At first, she sank into despair. Her apartment became a prison, each room a maze of uncertainty. Sounds were overwhelming, textures frightening. Every day was a struggle to simply exist. Yet, in that darkness, a faint light began to emerge. Not in the world around her, but within. She began to notice the rhythm of her own heartbeat, the vibration of footsteps, the whisper of wind through the trees outside. Life existed beyond sight, she realized. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn to see it in a new way, learning to feel life. The first days without sight were brutal. Elizabeth felt trapped in a world that had vanished overnight. Every step was uncertain. Every sound was a challenge. Even the familiar creak of her wooden floors became a puzzle she had to solve with her hands and her ears. Her children called, their voices full of concern, but Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to answer. She felt ashamed, broken, and useless, just as Daniel had said. How could she face them when she could no longer see the world she had promised to protect and nurture? It was Mara, her therapist, who first offered her hope. "Elizabeth," she said gently, "your eyes don't define you. They've failed you, yes, but your heart, your mind, your courage, they haven't. You will learn to see differently." Elizabeth didn't believe her at first. How could she see differently when the darkness was absolute? But Mara guided her through exercises, navigating her home with a cane, identifying sounds, sensing vibrations, and learning to trust her memory and intuition. It was slow, painfully slow. There were days she wanted to give up entirely, sink into the blackness, and never try again. But gradually, tiny victories began to appear. She could sense when her cat brushed past her legs. She recognized the steps of her neighbor on the staircase. She felt the warmth of sunlight through the window and could tell which direction it came from. Elizabeth discovered that losing sight sharpened other senses. She began to listen to the rhythm of life around her, the drip of water, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant siren of a passing car. She felt textures she had never noticed, the rough grain of her table, the softness of her bedsheets, the subtle vibration of a book she ran her fingers over. Slowly, she realized that life existed beyond vision. And with that realization came a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: independence. But the scars of betrayal ran deep. Daniel's words haunted her every waking moment. "When you stopped being..." Learning to feel life, rebuilding in the dark, the first months after losing her sight were a mix of fear and fragile discovery. Elizabeth had learned to navigate her apartment, recognize the rhythms of her home, and even prepare simple meals independently. But the world outside remained a terrifying unknown. One morning, she decided to step further. With her cane in hand, she ventured down the street, letting the sounds of the neighborhood guide her. Each step was deliberate, each movement cautious, but for the first time, she felt alive. Not blind, not defeated, alive. It was during these walks that Elizabeth discovered something remarkable. She could see people without eyes. She could feel the kindness in a stranger's voice, the impatience in a hurried step, the warmth in a laugh. She realized that she had spent her whole life relying on sight, on appearances, on superficial connections. Now she was learning the truth of human presence through sound, touch, and intuition. At home, Elizabeth began to write. She poured her grief, anger, and hope into journals, long letters she never sent, and stories that flowed from her heart. Words became her new vision, a way to process pain and articulate dreams she had long buried. Her world slowly expanded beyond the confines of her apartment. Elizabeth joined a support group for women who had faced trauma, loss, or sudden disability. She listened to their stories and shared her own, finding strength in connection and community. These women, each scarred yet resilient, became a mirror of the courage she had forgotten she possessed. Through this process, Elizabeth realized that Daniel's betrayal, his cruel words, and the darkness he left her with were not the end of her story. They were the beginning. She began to see that her worth was never tied to usefulness in someone else's eyes. It was inherent, unshakable, and independent. By embracing her new life, she discovered talents she never knew she had. Her writing flourished. Her intuition grew sharper. And slowly, she began to find beauty in the world she could no longer see with her eyes, but could feel with her soul. Yet, even as she rebuilt herself, the memory of Daniel lingered. There was a question she could not ignore. Could she forgive him? Or at least, could she release the hold he had on her heart? That question would shape the next chapter of her life, the chapter where Elizabeth would confront the past and claim her future.
Facing the past years had passed since Daniel walked out of her life. In that time, Elizabeth had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. She was no longer the woman who relied on his validation or lived in fear of being deemed useless. She had become someone whole, resilient, and fiercely independent. One evening, she received a message she never thought she would. Daniel wanted to meet. The words on the screen made her hands tremble, but not out of fear, out of clarity. She realized she no longer needed him to define her. He had no power over her anymore, yet she was curious. She wanted to see the man who had tried to dim her light. When they met, Elizabeth felt no anger, no desperate need for answers. She studied him with her intuition, sensing the tension in his voice, the avoidance in his movements. He tried to apologize, to explain, to justify. But Elizabeth noticed something else. He had not changed. He still measured worth by usefulness, still saw others through the lens of convenience. And that was when Elizabeth understood the final truth. She had already won. She had turned darkness into clarity, betrayal into wisdom, despair into strength. Daniel had left her blind, but she had gained vision in a way he could never comprehend. She didn't need his forgiveness, nor his acknowledgement. She only needed herself and the life she had built with courage. The clearest vision. Elizabeth woke to the sound of birds outside her window, a sound she had never truly noticed before. She smiled, feeling the warmth of sunlight on her face and the gentle hum of life around her. In the darkness she had once feared, she now recognized a clarity that no eyes could give. Her journey had been long and painful. She had lost her sight, her husband, and the life she had known. She had faced despair, loneliness, and the cruel echo of words that were meant to define her. Yet, through all of it, she had discovered something far greater than vision. She had discovered herself. Elizabeth had learned to see without eyes. She could sense the nuances of the world, the emotions of people, the vibrations of life, the beauty in small details that had always been there, waiting for her to notice. She had transformed her grief into art, her fear into independence, and her pain into compassion. She spent her days helping others, mentoring women who had been left or underestimated, sharing her story so they too could find light in darkness. She realized that true vision was not about sight. It was about understanding, empathy, and resilience. And at night, when the world grew quiet, she sometimes thought of Daniel. Not with anger, not with longing, but with gratitude. For he had inadvertently set her on the path to the strongest, clearest version of herself. Elizabeth had been told she was useless. The world had tried to convince her that losing her sight was the end. But in truth, it was the beginning. She had turned total darkness into clarity, pain into wisdom, abandonment into freedom. And now, for the first time, she could say without hesitation, she was whole, she was powerful, and she was finally free. The price of being useless to him had been paid, not by her, but by the man who failed to see her true worth. And in that price, Elizabeth found the clearest vision of all, herself.